All right, welcome. Today we're talking about the I/O setup for Pro Tools. I'm going to walk you through some steps on how to set up your I/O, make sure your devices are working properly, and if you need to remap the I/O, exactly how you would do that. First thing I want to say is that Pro Tools is immediately going to show you the dashboard as it opens. And, normally you'd think, well, we can just jump in and start working. If you are working on either a new device or a device that's been offline recently, or an interface, should I say, that's been offline recently, you do need to remap your I/O. You need to take a look at your I/O and make sure it's nice and clean. The I/O is the input-output configuration. It is what routes the inputs and the outputs on your interface device to the actual DAW. So it is possible to run multiple DAWs simultaneously. It's also possible to have only one of them report the input-output configuration from the interface. And so it's important, especially nowadays when a lot of people are using multiple DAWs, to understand what it looks like to route it here in Pro Tools. And know that if it's routed somewhere else, it might possibly not be available to use for Pro Tools. Additionally, we have internal routing that we use for mix buses and sends for effects. And we also want to route those too. So the first step is going to be to immediately cancel. And I see the biggest trouble when I'm teaching because a lot of students are doing their projects at home and then they bring them into the studio. And they're coming from their home I/O setup and they're walking into the studio and they immediately launch their session and they're seeing their I/O mapping from home. And that becomes problemsome. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take a look at this. First thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the playback engine, the interface itself, is online. So we're going to go to playback engine. It's going to show us whether our device is there or not. If it's not, obviously we have to fix that. Additionally, there are other options for devices, so make sure you choose the right one. Just as we're going to do an overview of this later, but just as a quick overview, the buffer size needs to be lower if you're recording, and it needs to be higher if you're mixing. We'll explain what that is later. And then the playback cache should also be high if you're mixing. So, but again, we're going to hit that later with the playback engine. Today we're focusing on the I/O. So we're going to go to Setup, I/O. Now, when we look at the I/O, it should show us a grid, and it should look like this. And there are tabs above the top. The input routing, output routing. The bus routing is the both external and internal bus routing system. And the reason that becomes important is because this is how you're going to still, like, even though you have outputs, this is how you're going to map where those outputs go and how they're connected internally. We'll talk about that in a second. The inserts are also a feature that is specific to the interface that you're using. So if your interface supports some form of inserts, these inserts are not an internal Pro Tools thing. These things are an external somewhere in your interface. And in my example, they're on the console of, I'm using the Universal Audio Twin, Apollo Twin, and that's all done in another piece of software. So there's a lot of interfaces out there that use an additional piece of software for the configuration, and that's kind of where you'd see that. We don't have mic preamps or hardware insert delays in most scenarios. You would know if you were running those kind of scenarios. But in this scenario, we're really focusing on input, output, and bus. Okay, so if you open this up and you don't recognize it, or it doesn't look the way that it should, or you're missing input or output counts, you're going to need to go through these steps and just set up a nice, clean, easy I/O. Additionally, you can also save these I/O setups for certain configurations that you may or may not want to use during certain situations. Now, the one good and bad thing about this whole thing, I'm going to show you the cleanest way to get it started, but you can name and reconfigure any of these items. Like you can literally move these items around, and that's definitely one of the biggest issues, is that because it can be moved around, it also means it could be in the wrong spot. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a nice clean one. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the input, and we're going to select all of these. You're probably very familiar with the idea that if I click the first one, I hold shift, and I click the last one, it's going to cover all of them. I'm just going to delete the path. Let's get rid of it. And then I'm going to select default. The default is going to give me whatever the default interface I/O design is. Now, if that's problematic or if it's not the right setup or for whatever reason the default doesn't work, you may need to manually map these, and then you can save it as a preset for the I/O, and then you can always use that to return. So let's talk about that. So the easiest format, you notice I was able to drop these in. If for whatever reason I needed to manually map these or I was missing something, what I would do is I would select new path, and it's going to give me a prompt for what kind of path I want. You can add a bunch of paths, but this is going to be, the main path is going to be the combination of like tracks. Like if I have a stereo left right, it's going to be a stereo, and then my left right is going to fall underneath it as a subpath. And that's super important. So if you have like a 5.1 system, your paths might be all 5.1s or 7.1s, and then you're going to add subpaths to the breakouts of those. Now notice it says add default channel assignments. That's great. And then it also says auto create subpaths. Well, that makes it a lot easier than having to manually create the subpath, because you could manually make the monopaths that go with the stereo path. Obviously, they're just going to be left and right. And then you can name it whatever you want. So if you just wanted to call this stereo input, there it is. And then when you open it up, you'll see it has a left and a right. And then if you hit the drop down, these are the subpaths: stereo input left, stereo input right. And then that way, in your Pro Tools system, if you're setting up an input from a track, if it's in stereo, you're just going to choose stereo input. If it's attached to analog, notice it says analog 1 and 2. If you need it in mono and you only need one of those channels, you're just going to pick one of those channels, and it'll show you that option under the list as well. But again, I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to then go to default, and I'm going to open up the default. Okay, there's my default. It lined up exactly where I needed it to. Oh, also additionally, up top, you'll notice these are, I have 8 analog inputs, I then have 8 optical inputs, and then I have another set of analogs inputs down towards the back. So, and these are internally routed elements that work inside of the universal audio system. But for the most part, you'll notice that I have I really only have 2 main analog inputs that are usable here, and then I have the 8 ADATs that are here, which are through the optical. That if I connect an external device, that I would have that. On the output, I'm going to do the same thing. So on the output, if I just want to make this clean, I'm just going to delete it, hit default. It's going to route everything that I need. Now here's where it gets fun. Okay, the bus, which I think is beautiful. When they added this, I mean, this was a really exciting thing, but it also became a terrible thing because it meant that things could be remapped in the wrong way. So notice on here, it says output SW return 1, 2. The problem with this on mine right now is that this software return listing is from another interface that I used to use. And what it automatically did is it adapted it to match the output feed from my Apollo. And so so notice it says this is the name of the element, the routing, what it'll look like in Pro Tools, and this is the mapped output. So in Pro Tools it could say output software return 1, 2, but the mapped output's actually going to go to my output on my Apollo. Again, same thing here. We're going to just delete them all, and we're going to hit default. And then notice now it matches. The stuff on the left is the same on the right. I could technically jump in here and name this whatever. I could call this out, left, right, right? I could rename all of these to say whatever I want them to. And then I could remap them manually somewhere else if I really wanted to as well. The beauty of this is really, really awesome, and it's very, very powerful. Let me show you exactly what I mean. These buses that are down below are all internal routing buses, meaning they're like bus sends and effects and things like that. If for some reason I was routing like a reverb patch somewhere internally, and then I decided that I want to actually have an external reverb attached, I could actually map that to the output and say, you know what, I want this to go to my output 3.4, my line 3.4, and that's going to send to a reverb unit now. And anything I set up with the buses in the session is just going to stay the same. Any automation, any panning, any specific levels that were given, like if I had a lead vocal that had more reverb and a guitar that had less, those levels would stay the same inside the session. They would just literally be rerouted to an external output. So this is a beautiful thing. The other thing you notice is like right now I only have buses 1 through 24. The thing about this is and down below it says active buses 24. So what I actually need to do is I need to set up more buses here. And what I'm going to do is I'll just hit new path. And if I slide this down, notice it says new path, path, bus. Let's make a bunch of stereo buses, and then it says how many do I want to make. And then here's where you could jump in and make, you know, an extra however many you need to. So like if I just jumped in and made an extra 32 buses, there we go. These are all internally routed buses. They could be used as submixes or effects, things like that. So the last step here is if we're happy with all this, we can go and hit export settings, and it's going to allow us to save this preset so that we can use it. We can actually take this file out of this IO folder and take it to any studio we want if we wanted to be able to use this configuration that we made. And then additionally, we can we can also load or import settings. And notice it says apply to all tabs or not. You could have it apply to just one of the tabs, and you could do it in, one by one, or you could have it applied to all tabs. The only other thing that I see that's common is sometimes, like in a studio environment, they don't like the way that this is listed or labeled, and so what they'll do is they'll say, well, this is this is 1, 2, and then the subpath is 1, and the subpath here is 2, right? And so what this would do is it would make it so that on the on the routing, it would always just say inputs 1 through whatever, and there's no text applied. So it becomes important with that routing setup that you can label it whatever you want, and again, when you reroute it or remap it or whatever, you just go back in and select it and delete it and hit default, and you're back in business. Again, if you need to save it, then you can also do that as well. If you needed to save it and set it up as a template that you can use anytime or recall, that's also super easy. And that's it for the I/O.